Well, welcome everyone. We are happy to have you join us today. My name is Zena Patton, and I will be guiding you through the initial part of our event. The DEIA committee and staff of the Soto Zen Buddhist Association, with the support of the Soto Zen Buddhist Association board, has been instrumental in envisioning and bringing to fruition the Celebrating the Voices of Women series and the event today. This is part of an ongoing effort to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in Buddhism and practice. Joining us today from Spain, I am honored to introduce a member of the Soto Zen Buddhist Association Board and Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Committee, Reverend Teresa Boza. Reverend Teresa Boza will provide the introductory remarks. Again, thank you, everyone. Reverend Boza, please take it from here.
So hello, everyone, and welcome to Zenshin, the first woman to be ordained as a Buddhist nun in Japan, personal experience in practicing as a householder. It is my honor to introduce our esteemed guest, Reverend Chozen Bays Roshi. With almost 5 decades dedicated to Zen Buddhism, she has made significant contributions to the Zen community. She founded the Zen community of Oregon, the Great Vow Zen Monastery, and the Heart of Wisdom Zen Temple. She is also an accomplished author and embodies her teachings in her roles as a pediatrician, mother, and wife. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Reverend Chozen Bays Roshi. Thank you.
Thank you, Zena and Teresa. And thank you for the invitation to give this talk. Zenshin has fascinated me for a long time. I'm glad that you're interested enough to come to this talk, interested in what writer Miwa Stevenson called the mysterious nexus of karmic causes and conditions that precipitated the original arising of the Buddha Dharma in Japan and led, after 1,450 years, to the Buddha Dharma coming to America and to us gathering today. She also said, history is a pulse of sacred influences that extend far deeper and wider through space and time than we can know. It's amazing that we can know anything about a young woman who lived 1,450 years ago in Asia. The reason is that various emperors in Japan ordered that historical chronicles be written each year in imitation of the records that had been kept in China. When Buddhism entered Japan, it brought with it a system of government, of writing, of taxation, of education, of taking of censuses, of architecture, and a rich tradition of music and art. This helped it be adopted early on by the aristocracy. Before we learn about the life of Zenshin, I'd like to give you some context, and I'm going to screen share so we can start a PowerPoint. So Zenshin was not only the first nun ordained as a Buddhist in Japan, as a person living in Japan, but as far as we know, the first person ordained as a Buddhist in Japan. So, which was a really big surprise to me when I found that out. Some of the context that's important is the geographic context, the relationship between China, Korea, and Japan. So as you know, Buddhism came from India to China and then to Korea. So it entered the Korean peninsula, which was at that time divided into four kingdoms. The main one was the Goguryeo kingdom, and then there were the smaller kingdoms of Bakche and Silla, and a very tiny area of the Kaya kingdom, which doesn't figure in the chronicles at all. Japan is surrounded by water. It's an archipelago, essentially a series of islands. And there's a distance between Japan and, there's not a distance between China and Korea. You can go by land, but you can't go by land to Japan from either China or Korea. You had to go by sea. And the distance between what we now call Japan and what we call now Korea at its closest point is 120 miles. But it's much longer depending on where you leave from. And if you leave from what we would see as the right side of Japan, the southwestern side of Japan, you have to go through the inland sea or around the lower islands of Japan to get to Korea. The distance between China is about between Japan and China is about 20 times as far, and both journeys are quite perilous. The chronicles tell us that it took Zenshin 2 months to sail from Japan to Korea so that she and her other nuns could have proper ordination. It's quite a dangerous journey. When I lived in Korea, when I was in high school, we took a ferry from southern Korea over to Nagasaki, one of the ports in Japan, and it was an overnight ferry, and we had a typhoon, and we all thought we were going to die. We were just very fortunate that we didn't die, and this is in modern times, because the boat would shift up and pause for a minute and then slide back down again, and we were just sliding around on the tatami floor where we were all sleeping together. The second element of context for Zenshin becoming the first ordained person in Japan as a Buddhist is the religious context. The indigenous religion in Japan at the time is what we now call Shinto, and it dealt with elements of fertility both of crops and of people. It did not deal with death. And when Buddhism eventually took over that realm, the realm of death, and then until recently, as a result of that, funerals and memorial services have been vital sources of income for Buddhist temples in Japan. Now, as newer generations are not religious and are not joining temples, this is a problem in Japanese temples, and there are about 15,000 empty Buddhist temples, Soto Zen temples in Japan, some of them very small in villages which are being emptied out. Over the years, there's been tension between Shintoism and Buddhism, and even persecution. When Shinto, there was an ascension of Shinto, and Buddhist temples were destroyed. But now there's a kind of peaceful accord between Shintoism and Buddhism. And most Buddhist temples have a Shinto shrine at the entrance, so that nobody is left out of all the prayers and offerings at any temple. And most people who go to temples don't recognize. The picture on the left shows a red torii gate, and that is always a symbol of a Shinto shrine. And on the right is a Buddhist temple, but that Buddhist temple would often have and still does, at its entrance, a Shinto shrine. And there are instructions online now about how to go to a Shinto shrine, to clap, offer money, ring a bell, and make your prayers. And the same about conduct at Buddhist temples. The third contextual element that's really important in talking about Zenshin is the role of women in Japan during this era. The women carried very important both religious and political power at this time. Young women served as maiko, or temple maidens in Shinto shrines, and they still do today. This is a picture of a modern procession of maiko. They led purification rituals, and they served as shamans. Shamans who could enter trance states and channel deities. They could let people know that disasters had occurred because certain kami were angry and needed to be appeased, and they often did rituals to help people appease those kami, those gods. As for political power, there were 8 women empresses in the Japanese government between the years 550 and 784, which is really remarkable considering that many countries would never allow women to rule. And I'll tell you about one of them a little bit later. And you might be aware that there is a modern Tibetan oracle, which has been consulted by the Dalai Lama in the past when he was wondering if an incarnate child, a child had been born as an incarnation of someone who had died. It's quite, if you look at a video of the modern Tibetan oracle functioning, it's quite interesting. There has to be an interpreter to interpret what the oracle is saying. So this is one of the famous shamans in Japanese history, Empress Jingo. Her husband was the emperor. She was the concubine at first, and her husband wanted to invade China, but a deity coming through Empress Jingo told her to invade Korea instead, saying, and this is all in the Japanese chronicles, written out. This is the language of the chronicles. So the deity said, "In that land there are gold and silver and bright colors in plenty. It is called the land of Silla," which is one of the kingdoms in Korea, "of the coverlet of paper mulberry." Mulberry is very important in the cultivation of silkworms. "If thou worshipst me aright, the land will assuredly yield submission freely, and the edge of thy sword shall not be all stained with blood." So there's some, Empress Jingo is not listed in the official list of women emperors in Japan. So there's some dispute about whether she's real or not, but there's quite a lot of literature about her. Now, the introduction of Buddhism from Korea to Japan. And of course, there's been a lot of tension between Korea and Japan over the years. Japan invaded Korea during World War II and had comfort women, a few of whom are still alive, who were, had to service multiple men every day. And Japan for a long time regarded Korea in modern times as inferior until Korean K-drama came along. And K-drama became very famous in Japan. And I was once in the Osaka airport about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and this mob of middle-aged women just ran to this man who was getting off the plane. And it was one of the K-drama stars from Korea that was very famous in Japan. So you never know what will help with diplomacy between countries that were enemies. So at this time, Korea and Japan were not enemies. And Buddhism was introduced in 563, according to the chronicles, when King Seong Myeong of the Pakche Kingdom in Korea needed help in his war with other Korean kingdoms. And he sent the Japanese Emperor Kime an image of Shakyamuni Buddha made of gold and copper, utensils for ritual bathing of the image, religious banners, umbrellas, and volumes of sutras. And he lauded Buddhism as the religion of the civilized world, recommending that it be adopted in Japan, and said, "This doctrine can create religious merit without measure and lead to the highest wisdom." So this was 10, 11 years before Zenshin was born, when Buddhism was first introduced. And here there's a very sweet description of how Emperor Kime, received the gifts. Emperor Kime reportedly, this is in the chronicles, leapt for joy upon hearing this and returned gifts of horses, bows, barges, and military troops to the Korean king. This type of exchange, Buddhist clergy and goods from Korea, for fierce warriors and military goods from Japan, is chronicled several times in the Nihongi record. It reveals both the source of each country's power and also what each country lacked. And of course, in modern times, we have requests from foreign countries for military goods. So this continues, maybe without the exchange of religious merit. Zenshin's father had immigrated to Japan in 522, so quite a bit before the introduction of Buddhism. He was probably from China. There's some question about whether he was from Korea or China, but he was probably from China. And at that time, Chinese and Korean immigrants were permitted by royal decree to adopt Chinese surnames. And many of them became part of the upper classes and the nobility in Japan. So in another presentation of gifts came in 577. So Zenshin would be 3 years old, or 4, depending on how you reckon age in Japan. The king of Bakche presented the now Emperor Bidatsu, who was the son of Kime, gifts of religious books, an ascetic, a meditation monk, a nun, a reciter of sutras, a temple architect, and a maker of Buddhist images, which I've always smiled at as a basic startup kit for introducing Buddhism into Japan. All you had to do was add nuns or monks, and in this case, we added nuns. So why did the gifts include umbrellas? Sometimes I get interested in these little details. Umbrellas are a very old Buddhist image, as you can see from this old statue on the left, and then from a more modern statue on the right. And people have written about why umbrellas imply protection from the sun, from sunburn, from maybe from rain, infection, and so on. Only wealthy people could afford umbrellas, so it implies prosperity. And some people say that the spine of the umbrella represents the energy channels of the spine. And so in Kundalini practice, that would be a representation of the spiraling energy of Kundalini leading to enlightenment. Also, the umbrella has an image, like especially golden umbrellas, and they're often gold or decorated with gold, like the halo in Christian art, where we see halos behind spiritual beings, and it represents enlightened beings. So this continues in modern times, that many Buddhist images, especially in Southeast Asia, have umbrellas. So when Emperor Bidatsu received these gifts, it led to an argument in the court. And this was very worrisome. So this is the part of the political context of what was going on at the time. And the cast includes royalty, particularly Empress Suiko, who becomes important later, and Prince Shotoku, also very important in Buddhism. It includes clans closely linked to the imperial family, the Soga clan, whose 2 ministers were Iname and later Umako, who readily took up Buddhism, and the 2 clans that opposed Buddhism, the Mononobe and Nakatomi clans. So when Emperor Kime received the gifts, the first set of gifts from Korea, he asked his ministers, is it permissible to use these objects sent from a foreign land? And the rest of the ministers said, no, we worship the 108 heavenly deities and the kami of our native land. We don't want to offend them. This is all in the Chronicles. But then Grand Minister Soga Iname said, as the only voice, it may be fitting for our country to prize something that other countries treat as precious. So Emperor Kime made peace among these arguing factions and ordered that the image be installed in the house at the rear of the palace of the woman who became the Empress Suiko. And a handful of people from China and Korea carried on worship of the Buddha image there. But the next year, there was an epidemic, and people said that the native kami were angry, that people were worshiping a foreign deity instead of them. However, Soga Inami said that the opposite was true, that the problem was we were not worshiping the correct deity, that being the Buddha. So let me talk a little bit about who was ordained. So in 584, Shima, who was the 11-year-old daughter of Shibatato, she was either 11 or 12, because when you're born in Japan in that time, you were a year old, no matter if you were born one day before New Year, you were 1 year. You were 1 year old, and then the next day, New Year's, you became 2 years old. So she was approximately 11 years old and the daughter of Shibatato, and he belonged to the Shoga tribe. And so they decided they needed some ordained people if Buddhism was going to be energetic in Japan. And they ordained her, and she received the Buddhist name Zenshin. Two other girls, Toyomi and Ishime, were ordained at the same time, and they were named Zenzo and Eizen. So we chant these names when we chant the Buddhist women's, it's not a lineage, but ancestors, the Buddhist women's ancestors. And whenever we come to Zenshin, I just light up because of this story. So Inami no Soga initiated the training and ordination of these children. So they had the protection of the Soga clan. And Empress Suiko supported the nuns. So here's Empress Suiko. She lived a long time. She became almost 100 years old. She was present when the emissaries presented Emperor Kime with the Buddhist gifts and doctrine. She became an advocate for Buddhism, faithful through all of its trials, which you'll hear about in a minute. She offered her home to house the Buddha image. She supported the 3 nuns. She later established the first Buddhist monastery and eventually became a nun herself. And she worked with Prince Shotoku later to establish a constitution for a society based on Buddhist values and arts. Education and spiritual studies flourished during her 35-year reign. And the official establishment of Buddhism, a firm establishment of Buddhism among the aristocracy in Japan, came on her 100th birthday. She lived past 100. So she lived to see that happen. So now I'm going to talk about, this is an image of perhaps how the Buddhist nuns dressed at the time of Zenshin. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the history. So we know that Zenshin's ordination occurred in the setting of intense political rivalry, that it was opposed by 2 powerful conservative clans, the Mononobe, who led the emperor's military forces, and the Nakatomi, who were in charge of the religious rituals of then Shinto, the indigenous religion. And of course, there would be reasons why they wouldn't want to introduce Buddhism if they were in charge of Shinto. But the head of the rising and progressive Soga clan supported Buddhism and said, all the countries of the West worship the Buddha. Why should Japan alone deny him? And then Suiko, who was the daughter of Emperor Kime and a granddaughter of Soga no Umako, who's the person speaking about adopting Buddhism, offered her palace at Sakurai as a site for a Buddhist temple. Zenshin's father was close to the Soga no Umaka, Soga asked Zenshin's father and two other men to search in all directions for someone who practiced Buddhism because they wanted these three women to be trained. They found Hye Pyon, a Korean layman who had once been a Buddhist priest but was now a layman, and an old Korean nun, Pap Myong, who was able to give initial instruction in Buddhist practices to Zenshin and her two friends. Soga erected a temple for the new nuns and enshrined a stone image of Miroku Buddha that he had requested from Korea. He also gave orders that they be provided with food and clothing. Soga had once witnessed a miraculous Buddhist relic that floated or sank in the water upon command, and that broke an iron hammer when someone made an attempt to break it. There are a lot of miracle stories about Buddhist images in Japan. He then became a fervent believer in the new religion and built a second temple in his own home. But 6 months later, an epidemic, it was probably smallpox, because in a certain period in Japan, every 15 years or so, there was an epidemic of smallpox. I mean, we've just been through a pandemic, but imagine every 15 years, a pandemic comes through and kills all the young people. This is what happened in Japan for about 200 years. So it swept, there was an epidemic of smallpox, and Mononobe, who was an arch rival of Soga, convinced the emperor that the pestilence was due to the establishment of Buddhism. So Mononobe destroyed a pagoda that Soga had built, set fire to the nuns' temple, and took the remains of the Buddha statue and flung it into a nearby canal. He summoned the three nuns, stripped them of their robes, what's called their three robes, their official robes, and had them flogged and imprisoned. But then over the next 3 months, it was in the summer, the epidemic grew worse, and even the emperor fell ill. And dying people cried out that their bodies felt as if they were on fire, and that this must be retribution, punishment for the burning of the Buddha image. So in a fire, the fire that destroyed the temple, Soga again addressed the emperor and begged to be allowed the blessing of the three treasures during this time of difficulty. The emperor decreed that Soga alone could practice Buddhism. So the three nuns were released from imprisonment into his care, and he rebuilt their temple. That autumn, the emperor died, but Buddhism did not. Zenshin and her nuns continued to practice, and 2 years later, they asked permission to go to Korea to receive full ordination. So you need a quorum of 10 nuns, 10 monks or so to have a full ordination, and that was only possible in Korea. Interestingly, we had a very good friend, bhikkhuni from Sri Lanka, who accompanied a group of nuns in Sri Lanka who wanted to go to Korea and receive full ordination. But this was opposed by this is in recent modern times. And this was opposed, and some of the women who wanted to go and receive full ordination in Korea were receiving threats traced back to the monks. And so they asked Venerable Kusuma, who had been a university president, a university professor, if she, and was much older than they were, if she would go with them. So she accompanied them. She also had threats, but she wasn't afraid. She was a very brave person. And went with them to Korea, and they spent several months there getting trained and came back as fully ordained nuns. And we know about the difficulties in Thailand with the same problem. So Zenshin and her nuns wanted to go to Korea to receive training in the precepts and full ordination. And they returned after 3 years. Remember that the trip took them 2 months by boat and was quite perilous. And then after they came back, many people then could be ordained, and Buddhist temples were built. The year after Zenshin left for Korea, the Mononobe clan was defeated in battle and subsequently annihilated. And she returned to a country that was ready with the encouragement of Empress Suiko to embrace Buddhism. And within 4 decades, there were 569 nuns and 816 monks in Japan. So the religion grew quite fast. When Zenshin was barely 30 years old, Prince Shotoku demonstrated his faith in the Buddha Dharma. So Shotoku and Empress Suiko worked together. He demonstrated his faith in the Buddha Dharma in the first constitution that he and Suiko established in Japan. He declared, quote, "Sincerely revere the 3 treasures. The 3 treasures, the Buddha, the law, and the priesthood, are the final refuge. Few men are utterly bad. They may be taught, but if they do not betake themselves to the 3 treasures, by what means can their crookedness be made straight?" So imagine that in our constitution. 2 years later, in 606, Shotoku had a 16-foot image of the Buddha erected in honor of Zenshin and her father and her brother. So we don't know the reasons for Zenshin's ordination. Maybe it was partly a political move on the part of her father, because we know in Europe, daughters were married off, and maybe he married her off to the Buddha so that Buddhism would be established. We don't know. But something happened to this young woman that transformed her. Somehow during the time that they were training with the old Korean nun in Japan, Papmyong, during the few months they were able to practice before the tides of public sentiment turned, the practice took in them. It took firmly enough to sustain them through the treasure of the destruction of their temple, the humiliation, can you imagine, of being stripped and flogged, and the misery of their imprisonment. Also, their heads were shaved, and of course, long hair was a sign of beauty and fertility and health in Japan. So most of the Japanese women, especially the nobility, had hair down to their ankles. So shaving is a radical act for a young woman in that culture. Perhaps this is the very time that the Buddha Dharma did take root in these girls, and thus in Japan, when it proved a true refuge in the midst of a time of suffering. And perhaps this is a test of who is a Buddhist, a person who practices in good times so that they can take refuge in the practice in the bad times, when the need is urgent. It is inspiring that a girl, who was really a child, found this fearless center for herself in an environment steeped in political intrigue and marked by the assassination of entire families. That could be the consequence of imperial anger, would be your entire family would be wiped out. So we're in a time of political intrigue and an attempt at assassination, and we fortunately have the Buddha Dharma to support us. Zenshin's life also tells us that the effect of one person's practice should not be underestimated. It can catalyze the transformation of an entire country. It can last for thousands of years, all through the ups and downs of human fortune, empires arising, civilizations arising and disappearing. And I often thank this earnest child, Zenshin, every time we chant the women's ancestors during our morning service. Her sincere practice has brought us all the happiest gift, the gift of Dharma, to us today. So here we have in Japan, so Buddhism went from China, India to China to Korea to Japan, and from Japan to the US. And of course, through Chan Buddhism from China too. So here we have Aoyama Roshi, and Aoyama Roshi established the Nisoto, the Soto Zen Buddhist convent in Nagoya. And they had a very difficult beginning, very poor. Dain Banaj, who trained with her, said once a farmer came and dumped an entire truckload of daikon at the Soto, and they had to eat it. They had to figure out a million ways to prepare daikon. They got so sick of daikon that they buried some of it, but Aoyama Roshi found it, had them dig it up, wash it off, and they had to eat it. The roof leaked, according to Dain Benaj, when they came in many, many places in the Zendo. But Aoyama Roshi persisted, and there are many Buddhist women who have similar stories. And this is Tenku Ruff of SCBA, who's meeting with her. This is a woman who is the temple priest at Daifukuji Temple in Kona, Hawaii. She's a wonderful, wonderful person. So happy, so joyous, and you can tell that everybody at her temple is happy. And she's a devotee of Jizo, as am I, so that's how we've become acquainted. And here we have a meeting at our monastery at Great Vow a number of years ago, pre-pandemic, of the SCBA, and you can see there are a lot of women in that picture. So now I'm going to show you very quickly a manga that I found, which will kind of review our what I've just talked to you about. So at this time, Japanese people worshipped indigenous Shinto deities. So the Buddha was considered a foreign deity, and Emperor Kime asked his retainers, what should we do with this foreign god? So they're all sitting around looking at this golden image. This Buddha has such a beautiful face. I've never seen such elegance before. Should we worship it? But then second panel is strong opposition from the Mononobe and Nakatomi clans who had been in charge of religious rituals. And then they warned that it would incur the wrath of traditional deities. So the emperor turned to Soga no Iname, a powerful statesman with strong ties to the Chinese and Korean immigrants, and he was in favor of accepting Buddhism. So the statue was given to Soga no Iname, but then a plague broke out, and the emperor was convinced that the disaster was blamed on the Buddhist worship of the Buddha. So the statue was thrown down a well. Some of the details of whether it's thrown in a ditch or in a well differ, and the Buddhist sanctuary was burned down. But in the meantime, they needed some priests to do religious services. So Shima, who became Zenshin, was the first Buddhist priest, and two other young girls, her friends, we think, perhaps even her ladies in waiting, also became ordained. And then there was a Buddhist sanctuary built for them. And then the Soga no Uname is dying, and he says, get me Urabe, a fortune teller. And the fortune teller says, the problem is that your father was not appropriate in terms of worshiping the gods. So Umako, who's dying, sent a messenger to the then Emperor Bidatsu to request permission to venerate the Buddha to help his father. And they said that our master's curse is in connection with failure to worship the Buddha. So then the emperor says, okay, we must heed advice and revere the Buddha. Then a plague broke out, and numerous people died. And then it was blamed on the spread of Buddhism. Then there was the fire. the Buddha image is thrown into the well. Then there were big rainstorms, thunder and lightning, strong wind. This has been, they said it's true to the chronicles, but it's been edited for manga purposes. So they brought the nuns over. The nuns were disrobed of their 3 robes. They were whipped. And then you know that they were eventually restored. And then they asked to go to Korea. And they left for Korea, where they received full ordination. And then they came back after studying the full precepts and began ordaining other people. So then we have at the bottom, in the bottom panel, the Buddhist temple, Asukadera, Hokoji, was built in 588. Using in the new temples in Nara all had architecture that came originally from Korea and China. And a new statue was requested, and Zenshin's nephew was in attendance when Empress Suiko bestowed praise on her achievements, and this statue was erected in memory of Zenshin and her father and her brother. So that's a journey through the life of Zenshin and the people who surrounded her, and how she and her companions remained devoted to the Dharma during times of great trouble and undertook a lot of risks, including the risk of going to Korea to bring full ordination back to Japan. So I do appreciate this young woman, and I can't imagine the courage that she had at her age. Let it be our courage too in difficult times. Thank you, everyone. If you have questions, there's no guarantee that I can answer them, or even comments. This is the time.
Right. And Reverend Bays, thank you so much. I really appreciate how you tied this into what is happening currently today, and just kind of giving that reminder that we have the Dharma to fall back on. So again, thank you so much for that. And I would just like to encourage others to, if you have any comments or any feedback, you can just put that in the chat.
That phrase, we practice in the easy times and the good times to be ready for the difficult times. I actually spoke that to somebody when I was sent from ZCLA up to Santa Barbara to lead a day-long retreat. And one young man came in for a private interview. And he said, it's hard for me to practice usually because the weather in Santa Barbara is always beautiful and the surf's up and I'm a surfer, and it's just hard to maintain a meditation practice. So I said, we practice in the good times, so we'll be ready for the difficult times, because they will inevitably come. I get an archaeology feed in my news feed, and I'm just stunned at how many civilizations arose, existed for a while, thrived, and then disappeared. Every couple of weeks, they find a new evidence of a civilization that they maybe had read records of, but didn't know where it was, and then they uncover it somewhere and realize that it was very advanced. So all man-made things. Our nation is only 200 years old, plus a few years, and well, someday it's not going to be here. And that may be sooner and that may be later. We don't know. But when you look at the span of history, you learn so much about how our practice can sustain us through all of the ups and downs that are inevitable when human beings are running the world or running a town.
Reverend Bays, we do have some feedback, and they said that it's lovely and enlightening talk. Thank you.
You're very
And
welcome.
and again, just a reminder, if you have any comments or questions, you can add that to the chat and we'll read that aloud for Reverend Bays.
I couldn't find any pictures of Zenshin. No surprise. But even, you know, in some cases, like with the emperors, there are sometimes some drawings. But there was nothing that I could find about that might indicate what she looked like, except that picture of from K dramas, or Japanese dramas, of what how a nun might have dressed. I encourage people, if you can read some of the chronicles. The history is amazing, and amazing in what it details. It talks about, you know, for example, when members of the royalty would become sick, especially in the emperor's family, they would order 800 people. This is after Zenshin's time. They would order 800 people to be ordained. So that was like a remedy. Kind of, you know, this tension between Shintoism and Buddhism, like, okay, we'll give a gift to the Buddha, we'll ordain 800 people, and maybe the Buddha will be happy and our fortunes will reverse. So you can detect these threads of indigenous religion and beliefs, and then Buddhist religion and beliefs. And they say it took time. It took some time. It has taken time to bring peace between those two traditions.
Okay. I do have another comment. I appreciate the talk, both the historical accuracy and and the recognition of how it may have felt for the women. There's another comment here. I hadn't known that Zenshin was only 11 years old. It is interesting that across cultures, there is a sense of the power of pubescent girls, and it looks like the shamans were also considered powerful, the older women. Thank you so much for the excellent talk.
Yes, very true. And we know, if we look in our country, the power of adolescence. So I have a 14-year-old grandson, so I track this somewhat on Instagram. And there's a whole new language that they're speaking, that they've developed to kind of bewilder their teachers and their parents. And so trends sweep through, you know, fashion trends and so on. But if you're living in a country where you don't have access to social media, and trends like saying skibbity or Ohio or mid means not good, not bad. It means like middling. This is junior high talk. Then all that passion that goes into fashion these days, and being on Instagram and being a TikTok star and so on, and these TikTok trends, that have killed some kids, like eating those super hot chips. All that passion that arises in early adolescence can be channeled into something for good, force for good. And then shamans, yes, old women were often shamans too. If you've ever seen the movie How Bodhidharma Came to the West, it's set in Korea. And there's a shaman in that movie. I really recommend seeing it. I have a whole collection of what I call Dharma films, because at the monastery we don't let people watch violent movies, but Buddhist or dharmically based movies on the weekend they can watch. And How Bodhidharma Came to the West is a really good one. Another really good one is Departures, which is a beautiful Japanese movie. It won an Academy Award for Best Foreign Film maybe 12 years ago. And it's about a young man who plays in the symphony orchestra, and the symphony is losing money, so they have to close it down, and he has to find a job. He has a young wife. And he ends up finding a job working essentially in a funeral home. And there are untouchables in Japan, even today, as there are in India. And so this is a job you don't talk to anybody about. And his wife is quite distressed that he's working with dead bodies, because that's something that only untouchable classes do. But it's just a beautiful, beautiful movie about how he becomes completely engaged in this ceremony of preparing bodies. It makes me get a little teary remembering it. And then how it involves his family history too, encountering the father that he didn't know since he was young. And his wife comes around. It's very, very sweet. So if you haven't seen Departures and you're in the Zen Buddhist Japanese tradition, you should see that. It also, that movie and also the movie Cherry Blossoms shows cremation, how cremation is done in Japan, and how unless you're royalty, if you're royalty, you were buried sitting up. But because there's 80% of Japan is mountainous and can't be used for agriculture, they have no room to bury people. So cremation is ancient tradition in Japan. But the family pushes the button to start the fire of the crematorium, and then they can actually look through a port and watch the body burn. Very, very potent. We did that with one of our members. We got the funeral home's permission to see his casket into the crematory oven and to push the button. And when Kyogen Carlson, who was a Soto Zen priest here in Portland, when he died, we did that, and we were able to watch the body burn. You know, we can't go to cremation grounds anymore like the Buddha did, or funeral pyres anymore, as was traditional in the old days, to contemplate death and the impermanence of the body. But this tradition still is possible to participate in.
Thank you, Reverend Bays. The next question we have is, I don't know much about modern Buddhist nuns being opposed and seeking to be fully ordained. So the male monks in their own tradition didn't want the nuns to have full priest powers and be equal footing with them?
You got it. Yeah, so this has come to light recently in Thailand. And particularly in the Thai forest tradition. So Ajahn Amaro, who's a good friend of ours, used to be head of a monastery in California and came and taught at our monastery because I wanted our students to know about all the different Buddhist traditions, the Theravada, the Mahayana, Dzogchen, and the Vajrayana. So we had teachers from different traditions come and teach. And eventually, Ajahn Amaro was sent to Japan. I'm sorry, talking about Japan, sent to the UK to become the abbot of Amravati and Chithurst monasteries in the UK. So these are in the Thai forest tradition. The women who were in preparation for ordination or who had been ordained, but not full ordination in the Thai forest tradition, chafed at some of the extra regulations that have been imposed on women after the Buddha's death. So the Buddha, when he died, told, as he was dying, told his disciples, you can get rid of some of the minor rules for the ordained. And they didn't do that. In fact, they consolidated the rules for women. So, for example, in modern times, in England, the nuns, one of the rules forbade nuns from walking around alone. Now, in the time of the Buddha, that made sense because a woman who wasn't protected by her husband or brother or husband was at risk of rape or being cast out of a village and dying of hunger or illness. So to prevent women from being raped in the time of the Buddha made this rule that women had to go about together, at least in twos. And you know, the Thich Nhat Hanh, people in the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition have maintained that. So in the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition, the monks are always supposed to have a companion monk with them, and the nuns also. And the idea is that this will ensure that they can help see if the other person is getting a little wonky, talking too long to someone like a woman and so on, and can help, you know, say, brother, I noticed that this was going on, or sister, I noticed this was going on. And so it's kind of an insurance policy, even still, in the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition. But the women in England, being non-Thai women, most of them, felt that they should be able to walk around the grounds of the monastery by themselves. And they chafed at various other regulations. So they asked that the regulations be changed, but the male higher-ups refused to change them. And then a Thai forest monk in Australia, after years of discussion, decided he would go ahead and give full ordination to women. And then he was expelled from the Thai forest tradition. So this is an ongoing issue in some. And as I told you about the women in Sri Lanka, how to become fully ordained. And some women give up. We have a woman right now at the monastery who was at Amravati and for I think 10 years, and wanted to be ordained but couldn't receive full ordination, so she came to our monastery. Very devout. But you know, all these difficulties make us tougher, right? Just like it did in Zenshin. Imagine if life were pleasant all day long, every day. How would we ever grow? How would we ever be interested in learning something, changing? That's the realm of the gods, you know? They say that the realm of the gods begins to disintegrate when people notice the first wrinkles and gray hairs. So I often think of the realm, the six realms. I often think of the heavenly realm as the realm of the Hollywood people who are in the in crowd, and earning lots of money and very famous, and they can marry anybody they want, and they have tons of money, and they can travel, and they're in demand and admired, and so on. But then, as we know, especially for women in Hollywood, you get wrinkles and your body settles due to gravity, then you're no longer in demand. So then you fall into the second realm. So there's the realm of the gods. Then the next realm is the realm of the jealous gods. So then you become jealous of those who are young and vital and beautiful, etc. And then below that is the human realm. So you can see us looking up and wanting to be in the realm of the gods. But I'm not so sure it's a healthy realm.
Thank you, Reverend Bays. The next question goes, I'm new to really experiencing Buddhism. I thought that Buddhism was often described as a philosophy rather than a religion. And that this Buddha is not really worshipped so much as respected. I'm not sure I understand why the authorities were so threatened by the worship of the Buddha. What am I misunderstanding?
Okay, so let me talk to several of your points, which are very interesting. Philosophy. So I call our monastery a recovery center for recovering philosophy majors. It's a kind of bland way to talk about Buddhism as a philosophy. But I find that many young people major or minor in philosophy because they are looking for a way to live life successfully and happily. But philosophy doesn't give that to them because philosophers always argue about their pet theories and so on. So at one point we had, I don't know, half the people in our monastery were recovering philosophy majors who had come to spiritual practice to look a bit deeper. I have nothing against philosophy. People love it. Like there's a beautiful program now on National Public Radio called Philosophy Talk, where they talk about modern problems and how philosophers would look at it. So then the issue of why, yes, worshiping the Buddha. So it kind of depends on what you mean by worshiping the Buddha. Our Sunday morning program, anybody can come to our Sunday morning program, which includes the very first thing is a chanting service, and that includes vows. And so that's can be startling to people who come for the first time thinking, Buddhism is something very cool. No, Zen is something very cool because everything is labeled Zen these days. Like there's an antique store in Portland called Zen and Now. There used to be a Zen body bra, which killed me. I had to look at the advertising to find out why did they call it a Zen body bra. And all they said is you'll feel peaceful when you're wearing this bra. Like crazy. Anyway, some people think like Zen is like, really, really cool. And I wear a mala, so I'm a Zen person. And they come to the monastery, and the first thing they encounter is this chanting practice, some of which is in a foreign language, and also full prostration bows. So we explain right away, every Sunday, we say, here at the monastery, we do full prostration bows in the direction of the Buddha statue on the altar. This is not in worship of the Buddha, but this is, we have two ways of talking about it. The yoga posture of humility, and all of us could use a little more humility, including one presidential candidate. And we don't say that. What we say, It's a yoga posture of humility. And when we bow, we touch our head to the ground. And so we're acknowledging that everything that we have comes from the earth. Everything that we have comes from the earth. If you look around where you're sitting now, there's nothing around you or that you're wearing or in your body that doesn't come from the earth and the energy of the sun. It's amazing when you consider that. So we're expressing our gratitude to Mother Earth, and then we raise our hands up like this. And this comes from India, because in India, this still happens when you greet someone that you revere, even your parents. You come in and bow down and touch their feet, and even in the old days raise their feet up. So what we say at the monastery is we bow down and then we raise. What we're raising up is our potential for greater wisdom and compassion, which is represented by the Buddha image. But we're not worshiping the Buddha image. So no, we don't worship the Buddha in the sense, in maybe the Christian sense of worshiping, or the Shinto sense of worshiping deities and making offerings to deities, the kami, or the gods, the many gods. Or in the Greek times, this was common too. You know, there were shrines to many, many, many deities, also in Egypt. But in particular in Japan, you had to be careful about not doing something that would anger a deity. Let's say a deity of a large tree. If you go to Japan, you'll see that there's worship of phenomena like waterfalls, giant rocks, mountains, the ocean, large trees. Natural phenomenon like that will often have a straw rope tied around them, which is a Shinto symbol of this is sacred. So isn't that wonderful that we consider sacred all these natural phenomena that we love? We go to national parks to see waterfalls and giant trees. So that's just a wonderful aspect of our gratitude and our realizing the sacred nature of everything that supports our life. But then you can mix it in with, you know, this tree deity got angry at me because I cut down the tree, and so now I've got to go to the temple and make offerings to appease that deity, or else my crop's going to fail. That's sort of what we might call that superstitious. But I just came back from a trip to mainland China, where we went to a number of Buddhist temples and monasteries. And the one thing I came back with is Buddhism is eternal. I mean, you don't have to call it Buddhism, but Buddhism is eternal, because in China, during the Cultural Revolution, so many temples were destroyed. And they've been rebuilt, and they're full of monks, and some places nuns, and very active. When we went to their traditional 5 peaks that are called Wutaishan, which are sacred to Manjusri Bodhisattva, the Bodhisattva of great wisdom. And we were the only foreigners going to all these peaks. All the rest were Chinese tourists in government-sponsored vans. So they drove up these million hairpin turns and the most bumpy roads I've ever been on, where I thought maybe I was going to break my teeth because I'm going like that for hours on end. But the Chinese people who were with us in the van and all the other vans were bringing food, giant boxes of rice, giant containers of oil for the winter, because in the winter the peaks are inaccessible, the temple peaks are inaccessible. And so the monks have to have food donated to support them during the winter. And our guide was saying, you know, these people are kind of superstitious. And my husband said, you know, that's okay, because they're supporting these monks. Even though we might consider them superstitious and criticize them for being superstitious and burning tons of incense and not knowing which deity is which and so on the altar, they are like the lifeblood of Buddhism in China, and have kept it alive through one temple we saw had burned down 7 times and been rebuilt. And of course, in Japan, there was the earthquake in the Noto Peninsula, and 46,000 houses were destroyed. And then some of our oldest cherished temples were destroyed. But they just finished for one of the temples, Keizan Zenji's original temple in the Noto Peninsula. So the original Sogenji was destroyed and finally rebuilt 14 years ago. And then another earthquake came and destroyed it again. So they're just rebuilding. We donated money to do that. But that's the kind of faith that's just amazing. And no matter what happens, it can't be destroyed. It will because it's the truth of our life, and it will reemerge in some form somewhere.
Reverend Bays, thank you so much for that. And I will move on to the next question.
Okay.
And during the time you lived in Korea, when was that? How did you perceive that society's attitude towards female Buddhist practitioners? So it's 2 questions. And let me know if I
Yes.
need to repeat it.
No, that's fine. I've got it. So I was 13 and 14. Actually, I didn't realize it of Zenshin's age. When my father, who taught library science at State University of New York in Albany, got a job to help one of the major Buddhist universities outside of Seoul, the capital, develop a library school, because they had books in Chinese, Japanese, English, etc., Korean, of course, but they had no classification system and no way for people to really access at the university to access the books. So it was a United States overseas mission, so part of a government grant to a university in Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, where my father had gone, to send a team over to establish a library school. So we were there for several years, and we fell in love with Korea and Koreans. And we traveled to Japan, as I mentioned, on this perilous overnight voyage. Really, there were people crying. I mean, it was unbelievable. You know, I was young, so I thought it was kind of fun, but the people who knew that we could die were scared. So anyway, our family went to Korea. And I really think it was the beginning of turning me into a Buddhist, because we saw several things. The whole Buddhist canon there's a library in Korea that has the original wood blocks for printing the whole Buddhist canon. They still exist there. And my father was interested in that library, of course. And then his team had a little vacation in rural Korea. And we were offered a trip. If we wanted to rise up before dawn, we could walk up the mountain to see the sunrise on the other side of the mountain. This was a traditional thing to do. It was a place where the original astronomical observatory was, which was basically a tube built of bricks. It was quite ancient, and astronomers would go inside, and even in the daytime, because all the light was restricted, they could see the stars. And they could follow the turning of the stars, even in the daytime, from this brick tube. So we went to see that. And then we were invited to go in the morning. So early in the morning, in dark, some of us set out and went on a path through the forest, up the mountain, over the top of the mountain to the other side. And then the sun came up and it illuminated a cave where there was a statue of the Buddha. So suddenly the light rays hit the face of the Buddha and illuminated the Buddha. And for some reason, it really touched me. You know, I had no prior interest in Buddhism. My family were liberal, but very devoted Christians. We went to Sunday school, we sang in choir, etc. But for some reason, that really touched me. And then the next, let's see. So I was young, so I wasn't really involved in finding out about training of monks and nuns in Korea. But there's a lovely video of Korean nuns. Gosh, I can't remember the name. I'm going to send this and also the link to the manga if you're interested. I'll send it to whoever I should send to at SCBA.
Oh, you can send it to me, Reverend Bays. Yeah.
But there's a lovely movie of nuns in Ango. So they close the doors of their temple and actually paper the doors of their temple and go into retreat in the winter, intense meditation retreat. But then they have a break where they all march over to a neighboring monastery, and they have a meal and they play some games with the monks over there, and then they march back and they enter Ango again. It's really sweet. So I'll make a note to send you that Ango in Korea. But at the time, I didn't know anything really about Buddhism. The next influence on me, I think, is always interesting. You know, we do something called way-seeking mind talks, which we got from San Francisco Zen Center. So we have people who've been practicing for quite a while talk about their life in terms of a path to the Dharma, the way-seeking mind. And it's fascinating to hear people's stories. And then these days they can show, you know, pictures of themselves and illustrate the steps along the way. So one of my illustrations would be going to Sri Lanka. And this was when I had been living in Australia. My first husband was a biologist and took his sabbatical leave to Australia and worked there in a research institute. And on the way back, we visited Sri Lanka because he had a graduate student from Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka, of course, was the country that Buddhism went to after the Buddha died. So that's a whole really interesting story of a king, Ashoka, who had won a battle. But as he surveyed the battlefield and all the dead bodies and mutilated bodies and grieving people, he thought how horrible, and he was converted to Buddhism. And he sent his son and his daughter, adults, to Sri Lanka, and they carried the Bodhi tree, a limb from the Bodhi tree, to Sri Lanka. So that tree is still alive, and it's in a temple in Sri Lanka. You can go and see it. The original tree that the Buddha attained enlightenment under in India died, but Sri Lanka sent them a branch back, so reestablish that Bodhi tree in India. So there are the remains of ancient, huge Buddhist monasteries in Sri Lanka that you can go and visit. They had toilets, they had running water. I mean, it's amazing to see how Buddhism flourished in Sri Lanka. And what touched me is when we were in Sri Lanka, there was just a different atmosphere. just an atmosphere of basic friendliness and kindness and compassion that pervaded the whole country. And, you know, they've had trouble since, but before, in that time, it was very peaceful. And every corner you turned, there was a Buddhist shrine. I had never been in a thoroughly Buddhist country before, and it had quite a profound impact on me. And then when we came back and my first husband began learning to meditate because he was having headaches and stomach problems as a new professor, and I saw the change in him when he began meditating on a daily basis, and then I got interested in meditating. And then here I am, many decades later. So you never know what on the path will give you a little nudge in the direction of finding something that will bring you great peace that you can always carry with you no matter what craziness is happening around you.
I am going to move on to the next and I believe the last question. Can you kindly suggest a translation of the Chronicles we might be able to access?
I will send that to, and there's a very interesting chapter in a book by a woman named Miwa Stevenson called The Founding of Monastery Gangoji and a List of Its Treasures. But it includes, so you don't have to go through the chronicles in detail, it includes all the chronicles and the stories that I have been talking about, but I will send that to. And how, how can people request that you send this to them?
So essentially what I'll do is circle back with you, Reverend Bays, about the resources that you will provide that you mentioned
Okay.
today, and then add that to the follow-up email.
Okay.
And
So
usually that email will include the recording of this event as well.
Okay, so we've got the Dharma movies, a few of those, including the Ango among the Korean nuns, and then the manga, if you want to see that, and then how to access the chronicles in Miwa's paper. Okay. You learn that people haven't changed. Really, not fundamentally. Yeah. But we do, our practice gives us a choice. Do we want to suffer or not? And when we're suffering, we have resources inside of us, not dependent on something outside, inside of us. And that's just the most wonderful gift. Maizumi Roshi used to say, the most wonderful gift is the gift of no fear. And that is the gift of the Dharma.
We have just a few minutes, and I just want to circle back to one question that was actually two parts, and I do apologize. And it was about, let's just see here. And it was about your experience in Korea. And the second part was, what was your perception about that society's attitude towards female Buddhist practitioners?
Okay. So more what I saw there was an appreciation of shamans, because I wasn't, I was only 14 and my family didn't go to, we saw temples as tourists, but you can't get back into the inner workings to find out what the training actually is, and are there many nuns training, or are there more monks training? So that wasn't available to me at the time. That's why I mentioned the movie about these very vigorous nuns. Koreans are very energetic people. And you'll see that in the movie. So I'm sorry I can't give any more accurate information about, but about now Buddhism is alive and well in Korea. But even in China, for example, when we went to one temple, we saw some monks over on the side, and my husband and I, who were wearing not our full robes, our full regalia, but our samoe and raksu and so on, we asked our guide, could we ask some questions of these monks over in the corner of this temple? And she went over and talked to them, and she came back and she said, they had said, the government does not allow us to talk to foreigners. So when on part of our tour, we were with someone who was a Chan teacher, Guogo, who's a Chan teacher in Florida, and he had contacts in Taiwan and also in mainland China. So we were actually able to go to the temple where Dogen Zenji met his teacher, Ru Jing, to Jiantong Monastery, which is thriving. At one time, it had 900 rooms. Now it only has 600. And at the time of the Cultural Revolution, when many temples were destroyed, the story we heard is that Zhao Enlai, who was one of Mao's closest associates and had the army stationed, barracked at Qiantong Monastery in mainland China so that it wouldn't be destroyed. So he was a closet Buddhist, is what we were told. So there's there's so many forces and interesting stories out there. But particularly when I was so young in Korea, getting behind the scenes, it was impossible to do. But now sometimes you can. Yeah, there's only 1 minute left, so I'm going to stop telling you stories.
Reverend Bays, thank you so much.
Yeah.
In closing, everyone, I just want to thank you, Reverend Bays. Thank you so much for participating in this event series. And to the SCBA, Soto Zen Buddhist Association DEIA Committee. Also, I just want to thank everyone who's attending today. Thank you very much. We deeply appreciate it. And before we end this event, please take a moment to take a look at the information in the chat here, and just keep in mind that we'll also send the if you would click on the form here to give us your feedback about the event, that would be so very helpful to us. Also, just wanted to give you the link to the schedule, that we have more events that will go through the year. And the next event will be in August, on August 24th. And that's a Saturday. And it's the Women in Himalayan Buddhist Traditions, Transmission and Transformation. So you can click on the link and find out more details about the registration for it. Again, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and you have a great rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.